Tav Chof Aleph. We begin the Gemara today on right by the Gemara after the Mishnah. So, what was the first halach it said in the Mishnah? This Mishnah Bechlal spoke about the fact that when it comes to the halachas of Tumah and Tara, there are many chumras. The Mishnah said 11 in total, or maybe 10 in total, as we'll see here in the Gemara. Chumras that there are for Kachim more than Truma and the other levels that are lower than Kachim. So the Gemara starts with the first one that it mentioned in the Mishnah. The first thing that was mentioned in the Mishnah is when you toivel kelim in the mikveh. So for any tefillah that you do for Truma or anything else, you can put one keli inside another keli and toivel it together that way in the mikveh. When it comes to Kachim, you can't put one inside the other. They have to be toiveled separately. Frag the Gemara, so b'kaidish, my time aloi. What's the issue of toiveling one keli inside another keli? Amar Abila, so Ravila says, Mipnei shekveidoi shal keli chaitzis. The inside keli that might be heavy, and it's going to go down into the keli that's outside, that's containing it, and it might create a chatzitza. The water might not get in properly, in between these kelim, to properly toivel it. That's the issue. So there's an issue of a chatzitza here. The pshat I mentioned, by the way, is Rashi's pshat in this inyan, that you're trying to toivel two kelim, they both have to be toiveled, and you're putting a small keli into a larger keli and toiveling it together. The Rambam says a slightly different shot, and this is basically the way we do it today a lot of times. When you go to toivel dishes, what do you have, like a sort of a bigger basket, and you put a bunch of kelim inside this basket, and then you toivel it inside this mikveh. So the Rambam says that's what this Mishnah is talking about. When you take like this large keli, and the larger keli doesn't even have to be toiveled. Just for convenience sake, you take a large keli and you put a bunch of small kelim inside of it and you toivel it inside the mikveh that way. So this is the issue over here, like the Gemara just said, according to the Rambam's shot as well, that it's a chatzitza. You're afraid that the water might not get into every single area because of the weight of the smaller kelim inside. So you have to take each keli individually and toivel it in the mikveh. Frag the Gemara, if that's the issue here, v'hamid the seife mishum chatzitza. In the Sefer of the Mishnah, one of the chumras that it mentions regarding Kachim, there the issue is a chatzitza. If so, Reisha lav mishum chatzitza. That would indicate that this first halacha here in the Reisha of the Mishnah is not because of a chatzitza. Now, what it was one of the cases that it said later in the Mishnah. Ktani Sefer, in the later part of the Mishnah, it said v'loi kimidas hakodesh midas hatrumah. The halacha regarding Kachim is not the same like the halacha for Trumah. Shebakaidesh, when it comes to Kachim, matir, umangiv, umatpil. So if you have something that was tied, you have to untie the knot, and you also have to dry it properly, and then you could toivel it in the mikveh. V'achakach, and only after you toivel it, kaisher, you could tie the knot back again. What's the issue? Why do you have to untie it, and why do you have to dry it? Because if there's a knot, the water might not get in properly. If it's not fully dry, so then the water of the mikveh doesn't reach every single part of it. Where it was moist and wet before, the water of the mikveh doesn't reach there. So therefore you have to dry it and untie it, so there shouldn't be any chatzitza. But when it comes to truma, kaisher v'achakach matpil. By truma you could leave it tied and you can toivel it with the knot, and we're not concerned about the chatzitza. Right? So you see the Mishnah later is telling us the chumrah that Kachim has as a result of this halacha that we're concerned about a chatzitza. So if later it talks about the chumrah related to chatzitza, wouldn't it make sense to say that in the beginning of the Mishnah, when it mentions the chumrah about toiveling kelim inside kelim, that's not related to chatzitza? That should probably have a different reason. So the Gemara answers, no, Reisha v'seife mishum chatzitza. Actually, the first din of the Mishnah about toiveling a keli inside a keli, and the din of the Sefer about untying knots, they are both as a result of this same halacha that when it comes to Kachim, we're more machmer and concerned about a chatzitza. And the Mishnah has to tell me that we're machmer regarding the chatzitza in both of these cases, because the cause, the concern of the chatzitza is not the same. If I would only say the case of the Reisha, Havamin, I would say, there the reason why we're concerned for Kachim, that there will be a chatzitza and you can't toivel it in another keli, mishum kveidah shel keli, because as we mentioned, one keli is heavy inside another, and the water might not get in there at all. So that you have that problem there. Aval Sefer the leka kveidah shel keli, but in the Sefer you don't have the heaviness of a keli, so maybe there the issue of chatzitza is not the same, it's not as strong. So maybe if you have something which has a knot in it, I could rely on the water making its way in between the knot, and it's not a concern. The Mefarshim point out that when the Gemara is speaking about something that has a knot, it can't be speaking about a very tight knot. If we're talking about mamish, a very tight knot, and it's impossible for water to get in, then obviously that's a chatzitza. Not even for kachim, even for truma, or for anything, you have to untie the knot. We're talking about a knot which is not so tight. So therefore I would think that over there's no issue of a chatzitza. Similar in the reverse, I would say, if I would say in the seifa regarding something that has a knot, that there I'm concerned about a chatzitza, so then Havamina, I would say, reason why over there for kachim. Such a kind of tefillah doesn't work because of the chatzitza. Mishom the kitra b'maya. What happens to a knot is, the Bach takes out the word b'maya, but the mishum the kitra ahadukim ahadik. When you have a knot and you toivel it in water, the water itself sort of tightens the knot. And therefore it's possible that itself should cause that the water shouldn't be able to get in. So there's a special concern specifically regarding a knot. But in the reisha where you're talking about toiveling one keli in another keli, so there you don't have that concern. And I would say, akfuye makfile lemana. Over there what happens is, in the reverse, when you put one keli and another keli inside the mikveh, the water itself helps the inside keli float and not be stuck in the heaviness to the outer keli. And therefore the water will get in. Lahavya chatzitza. And therefore there, I would say that that's not considered a chatzitza. So therefore it's tziricha. They're both halachas regarding chatzitza. The Mishnah is telling it to you, each one, because there's a chiddush in each case. So the Gemara now explains, Rab Ila, which was the one that said this pshat, that the concern about one keli in another keli is that it could be a chatzitza, l'taimei. So he follows his reasoning that he said otherwise regarding our Mishnah. The Amar Rabbi Ila Chanina bar Papa. Rabbi Ila said in the name of Rabbi Chanina bar Papa regarding our Mishnah, Eser Mailois Shanukan. In the Mishnah, you have 10 stringencies that there is by kachim more than truma. Now, if you learn the Mishnah and you count all the cases, it's really 11. There's 11 stringencies. But the reason why Rabbi Ila said it's only 10 is because, as the Gemara just explained, 2 of them are really the same thing. It's a stringency based on the concern of a chatzitza. The Mishnah divides it into 2 cases because there's a chiddush in each one. But essentially, it's the same chumrah out of the concern of a chatzitza. And therefore what he said was, Chamesh Rishainais, the first 5 stringencies that it says regarding kachim, Bein L'Kaidesh, Bein L'Chulin Shanas Al Taras HaKaidesh. Those are stringencies that we apply, whether literally for kachim, and also for a person that eats chulin, but he eats it with the stringencies on the level to be kaidesh, to be pure like kachim. Those are the first 5. Achreinais, but the last 5 in the Mishnah, l'kaidesh. Those are stringencies that we apply only for kachim. Avalei l'chulin shenasu al taras hakaidesh. But we don't apply those stringencies regarding chulin that a person is eating with the same level of purity as kachim. So there's a difference. The stringencies, the first 5 and the second 5 are not the same. The Gemara explains why. What's the difference? My timer. Chomish kamaisa. The first 5 stringencies mentioned in the Mishnah, the isluhu, drare, the tume, midairaisa. They have a connection, or they can maybe even cause a tume minatayra. So therefore, gazru buhu rabbanon, those 5 gzeiris, those 5 stringencies that are related to a tume dairaisa, so their chachamim decree them, bein l'kaidesh, that you should be careful with these things, both for kachim, and bein l'chulin shenasu al taras hakaidesh, and also for chulin, that a person is eating on the level of tara like kaidesh. Basraisa, but the last 5 chumras mentioned in the Mishnah, the leslu drara the tume midaraisa. They don't have any, they're gzeiris. The Gemara will explain the reasons for those gzeiris, but they're not gzeiris out of any connection or any concern that it might come to a tumim b'deraisa. So therefore, gazru b'hu rabbanon l'kaidish. So the Chachamim made those decrees only for kachim itself, but l'chulin shenasu al taras hakaidish legazru b'hu rabbanon. But for chulin that is being eaten on the same level as tara as kaidish, for those Chachamim over there, the Chachamim did not apply their gzeira. And therefore, for the last 5 is not for chulin shanasu al taras hakaidish. Rashi here specifies what this is about. Rashi, if you look here on the side, there's a long Rashi. He explains that, for example, when it comes to the keli b'toich keli, the first case of the Mishnah, there's a concern related to a tumah dairaisa. If this keli was tamim min atayra and there's a chatzitza, so then it did not become tar even min atayra. Or the next case of the Mishnah where it talks about one part of the keli and another part of the keli becoming tameh, that regarding kachim. said in the Mishnah that if one part of the keli becomes tummy, the whole keli becomes tummy. So that's based on a gzeira of tumas mashkin, that if any liquid comes in contact with keli, chachamim will geyser that the keli becomes tummy. And the source of that gzeira is because we're afraid that liquids that come directly from a zav could come in contact with it, which is a concern of a tumah deiraisa. Rashi goes through all the cases. Another case we had in the Mishnah was where a person is carrying something which is tameh, and at the same time in one hand, and in another hand is carrying a barrel of wine. So for kachim, there's a real concern menatayra that the tameh thing might end up touching the wine that he's carrying at the same time. So there's a concern of a tumah deiraisa. Similar benegay to the garments. Rashi says that the Mishnah said that the garments that a person wears, so even if a person is careful with tara regarding the level of trumah, but for kachim, it'll still be tameh. There's also a concern menatayra that maybe this person's wife is a nida and she made it tameh. And the last thing Rashi says is regarding kelim hanigmarim b'tara, the kelim that a person made and he just finished, brand new kelim, and it was all made b'tara, but there is a concern that maybe there was an ama'aretz there in the factory where they were making the kelim and he had something tameh that touched these kelim. So the point is, the first 5 things mentioned in the Mishnah are all gzeiris that could cause tumah deiraisa. So that was a gzeiris that Chachamim applied even for chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. The last 5, though, are for different reasons, as the Gemara will explain later. Now the Gemara brings another pshat in the Mishnah. Rava argues on this entire pshat regarding toiveling one keli inside another keli. Mid the seifa ava mishum chatzitza. If in the seifa of the Mishnah it tells you that there's a chumrah because of the issue of a chatzitza when you're making a knot, reisha lav mishum chatzitza. So in the reisha, toiveling one keli in another, the issue is not chatzitza. What's the reason in the reisha? There's a different gzeira. Gzeira shelo yatbil machtin v'tzinoiris. Here the gzeira is that if you're going to allow a person to toivel one keli inside another, he might come and take very small things like little needles or these little forks or these little spinning hooks, whatever the hooks, these little, very little kelim, and he might then insert them bekeli she'ein befiv k'shveiferes hanoid. You might put it inside a very little tube that's smaller than this straw that's used in a noid. What's a noid? A noid is like this leather flask that a person uses, sort of the straw to drink with it out of it. So if you have a very, very little tube and you put inside there these little needles and these little kelim, and that's how you tovel it inside the mikveh. So even though it has an opening, this tube has an opening and the water of the mikveh could go inside this little tube, but because this tube is so tiny, so the water that's inside this little tube is not considered to be connected to the mikveh. So what we're concerned is if you allow a person to tovel one keli inside another keli, so he might not know the differentiation and he might come to put even something inside a very small keli and then it's not considered to be connected to the mikveh at all. As the Gemara here brings the source of this. Kiditnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Eirov mikvahis, if a person wants to mix the waters of one mikveh and another mikveh. I mean, this is the way we have the mikvahis today. When you have the actual mikveh that people tovel in, and that's not rainwater, and then you have another mikveh, a boyer on the side, or our menig actually is, the mikveh of the Rebbe Rashab was a boyer below, under the mikveh that you're toveling in. And then you have a hole in between that connects the two bayris, the two mikvahs with one another. So if you want to have an iruv mikvahs, you're mixing one mikveh and another mikveh. I mean, Rashi says a little bit of a different example from what we have today. That Rashi says the example is that you have one mikveh which has 40 saw, so it's a kosher mikveh, and then on the side of it you have a mikveh that's less than 40 saw, so it's not kosher mikveh. But then you have a pipe of water that runs between them that connects the two, and therefore even the mikveh that's less than 40 saw will be kosher. So now, kishveiferes hanoid, that pipe of water that runs between the mikveh has to be the size of shveiferes hanoid. And what does this mean? Ka'ovya or kechalala, has to be large enough, like the thickness of this entire shveiferes, this entire tube, and like the chalal, which is the space inside this tube that runs between one mikveh and another. Now, what's that size? How do we know how big this straw, this tube between is? So the Mishnah says, "Kishtei etzbois, chayzeres lemekayman," has to be as big as 2 fingers, But the Mishnah adds 2 fingers that a person could twist around his fingers and to bring it back to its place the way it was before. If it's exactly the size of 2 fingers, you stick your 2 fingers inside, you won't be able to maneuver your fingers around. It has to be a little bit of space for your 2 fingers to be able to maneuver it around. That's the minimum size of how large that opening between one mikveh and another has to be. Otherwise, if it's not that size, so then it's not a connection b'chlal. So it's the same thing also. If a person is placing these little tzinaitis, these little pins, putting it inside this little tube, and it's in the mikveh, even if it's open, but because the tube is so small, the water that's inside this little tube is considered to be like it's disconnected from the mikveh. That's Rav's pshat. So the reisha of the Mishnah is a subject that has nothing to do with chatzitza. So the Gemara concludes, just let's finish the inyan here. So Nasavar law, Rava holds, Kahad, the Amar of Nachman, Amar Abba Baravua. So what did he say? Yud Aleph Mailas Shanukan. In the Mishnah it's saying 11 chumras. It's not 10, according to what Rabbi Ila before, since 2 of them were the same subject of chatzitza, so it's really just 10. But according to him, it's 11. So Sheish Rishaynais, the first 6, Bein LeKaidish, Bein LeChulin Shanasal Taras HaKaidish, those are chumras that Chachamim were geyser and applied, whether for kachim itself and for chulin that a person is eating and dealing with and on the same level of tara as kachim. Achraynais, the last 5, LeKaidish, they're only for kachim, Aval Lei LeChulin Shanasal Taras HaKaidish. But not for chulin shanas al taras hakaidish, like the Gemara explained before. The first 6, according to his opinion, are things that are related to tumas da'iraisa. So they were more machmer. The last 5 are gzeiris that are not connected to any tumas da'iraisa, and therefore over there's no chumrah for chulin shanas al taras hakaidish.